I extended my arms sorrowfully towards those who were dear to me, but in vain. My fate was inevitable. This thought, together with a crowd of others which arose in equal disorder, excited a real tempest of the mind. It was like the struggle of a soul that sought to disengage itself from its earthly habitation. It turned my hair grey. Fortunately, the crisis was short, and, as it happened, the mind came forth triumphant, so much so indeed that from this moment I seemed above the world. I felt that I could thenceforth defy injustice, ill-treatment and sufferings. Above all, I vowed that neither complaints nor solicitation should escape me. But let not those of my companions to whom I appeared tranquil in those fatal circumstances accuse me of being deficient in feeling. Their agony was prolonged in detail, mine operated all at once. One of those coincidences, which is not the least extraordinary of my life, recurred to my thoughts soon after. 20 years before, and during my emigration to England, without possessing any worldly goods, I had refused to seek a certain fortune in India, because it was too remote, and I thought myself too old. Now, at 20 years older, I was about to quit my family, friends, fortune and enjoyments, to become a voluntary exile, 2,000 miles off, in the midst of the ocean, for nothing. But no, I am mistaken. The sentiment that now impelled me was infinitely superior to the riches I then disdained. I followed him who had governed the world and will occupy the attention of posterity. The Emperor continued to appear on deck as usual. I sometimes saw him in his cabin, but without communicating what I had heard, I wished to console him and not to be his tormentor. The reports had, however, reached him, but he had come so freely and confidently on board the Bellerophon, he had been so strongly invited by the English themselves, he so completely regarded his letter to the Prince Regent, transmitted beforehand to Captain Maitland, as so many tacit conditions. He had, in fact, acted with so much magnanimity throughout the proceeding, that he repelled with indignation all the fears which were attempted to be excited in him, not even permitting those around him to entertain doubts. 27th, 28th. It would be difficult to describe our torments and anxiety at this moment. Most of us were dumb and inanimate. The least circumstance which transpired from the shore, an opinion, however unimportant, expressed on board, an unmeaning paragraph in a daily paper, became the subjects of our most serious arguments and the cause of perpetual oscillations between our hopes and fears. The most trifling report, whoever appeared, was urged to give a favourable version of deceitful anticipations. So little do the ardour and activity of our national character contribute to endow us with that stoical resignation, that imperturbable composure which can only be acquired from settled principles and positive doctrines imbibed from early infancy. The public papers, particularly those of the ministerial side, were let loose against us. It was the outcry of ministers preparing the blow they were about to strike. It would not be easy to form an idea of the horrors, falsehoods, and imprecations accumulated on our heads, and there is always a portion communicated to the multitude, however well disposed it may be, so that the demeanour of those around us become less easy, while their politeness became embarrassed and their countenances more misgiving. Lord Keith, after announcing himself for some time before, had only just made his appearance. It was evident that our company was shunned, our conversation avoided. The papers contained an account of the measures which were about to be taken, but as nothing official appeared, and there was some contradiction in the details, we were induced to flatter ourselves as to the final result, thus remaining in that state of suspense and uncertainty which is worse than a knowledge of the most painful truths. Nevertheless, our arrival in England had produced a singular sensation. The presence of the Emperor excited a curiosity bordering on delirium. It was the papers themselves that informed us of the circumstance, while they condemned it. All England seemed to hurry towards Plymouth. A person who had left London, on hearing of my arrival, was obliged to stop on the road for want of post-horses and accommodation. The Sound was covered with an immense number of boats, for some of which, we heard, above £50 had been paid. The Emperor, to whom I read all the newspapers, did not betray any decrease of composure, either by his conversation or general habits. It was known that he always appeared on deck towards 5 o'clock. A short time before this hour, all the boats collected alongside each other. There were thousands, and so closely connected that the water could no longer be seen between them. They looked more like a multitude assembled in a public square than anything else. When the Emperor came out, the noise and gestures of so many people presented a most striking spectacle. It was, at the same time, very easy to perceive that nothing hostile was meant, and that if curiosity had brought them, they felt interested on going away. We could even see that the latter sentiment continued to increase. At first, people merely looked towards the ship. They ended by saluting, some remained uncovered, and occasionally went so far as to cheer. Even our symbols began to appear amongst them. Several individuals of both sexes came decorated with red carnations, but this was only turned to our detriment in the eyes of the ministry and its partisans, so that it rendered our agony more poignant. It was under these circumstances that the emperor, who, notwithstanding his calm demeanour, could not help being struck by what he heard, dictated a paper to me, worthy of serving as a model to jurists, discussing and defending his real political situation. We found means of conveying it on shore, but I have kept no copy. Ministerial Decision 29th-30th. A report had circulated during the 2 previous days that an Under-Secretary of State was coming from London officially to notify the resolutions of the ministers with respect to the Emperor. Accordingly, he appeared. It was Sir Charles Bunbury. He came on board, accompanied by Lord Keith, and delivered a dispatch ordering the removal of the Emperor to St. Helena, and limiting the number of persons who were to accompany Napoleon to 3, excluding, however, the Duc de Rovigo and General Lallemande, comprised in the list of proscribed. I was not called before the Emperor. The bearers of his sentence spoke and understood French. They were admitted alone. I have since heard that he objected and protested with no less energy than logic against the violence exercised on his person. He was the guest of England, said Napoleon, and not its prisoner. He came of his own accord to place himself under the protection of it. The most sacred rights of hospitality were violated in his person. He would never submit voluntarily to the outrage they were preparing for him. Violence alone should oblige him to do so. The Emperor gave me the ministerial document to translate for him, of which the following is a copy, communication made by Lord Keith in the name of the English ministers. As it may perhaps be convenient for General Bonaparte to learn, without farther delay, the intentions of the British government with regard to him, your lordship will communicate the following information. It would be inconsistent with our duty towards our country and the allies of His Majesty if General Bonaparte possessed the means of again disturbing the repose of Europe. It is on this account that it becomes absolutely necessary he should be restrained in his personal liberty, so far as this is required by the foregoing important object. The island of St. Helena has been chosen as his future residence. Its climate is healthy, and its local position will allow of his being treated with more indulgence than could be admitted in any other spot, owing to the indispensable precautions which it would be necessary to employ for the security of his person. General Bonaparte is allowed to select amongst those persons who accompanied him to England, with the exceptions of Generals Savary and Lallemande, 3 officers, who, together with his surgeon, will have permission to accompany him to St. Helena. These individuals will not be allowed to quit the island without the sanction of the British government. Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn, who is named Commander-in-Chief at the Cape of Good Hope and seas adjacent, will convey General Bonaparte and his suite to St. Helena, and he will receive detailed instructions relative to the execution of this service. Sir G. Cockburn will, most probably, be ready to sail in a few days, for which reason it is desirable that General Bonaparte should make choice of the persons who are to accompany him without delay. Although we expected our transportation to St. Helena, we were deeply affected by its announcement. It threw us all into a state of consternation. The Emperor did not, however, fail to appear on deck as usual, with the same countenance, and, as before, tranquilly surveyed the crowds which seemed so eager to see him. 31st. Our situation had now become truly frightful, our sufferings beyond every power of description. Our existence was about to cease with regard to Europe, our country, families and friends, as well as our enjoyments and habits. It is true, we were not forced to follow the Emperor, but our choice was that of martyrs. The question was a renunciation of faith or death. Another circumstance was added, which greatly increased our torment. This was the exclusion of Generals Savary and Lallemande, whom it struck with the utmost terror. They saw nothing but a scaffold before them, and felt persuaded that the ministers of England, making no distinction between the political acts of a revolution and crimes committed in a moment of tranquillity, would give them up to their enemies to be sacrificed. This would have been such an outrage on all law, such an opprobrium for England herself, that her enemies would be almost tempted to invoke it, but it was only for those who were included in the same proscription to talk thus. At all events, we did not hesitate to desire that each of us might be amongst those whom the Emperor would choose, entertaining but one fear, that of finding ourselves excluded. August 1st. We still continued in the same state. I received a letter from London, in which it was strongly urged that I should be extremely wrong, nay, that it would even be a crime, to expatriate myself. The person who thus wrote also addressed Captain Maitland, begging he would assist by his efforts and counsel to dissuade me from such a resolution. But I stopped him short by observing that, at my age, people generally acted on reflection. I read the papers every day to the Emperor. Whether influenced by generosity, or that opinions began to be divided, there were two amongst the number that pleaded our cause with great warmth, compensating in some measure for the gross falsehoods and scurrilous abuse with which the others were filled. We gave ourselves up to the hope that the hatred inspired by an enemy would be succeeded by the interest which splendid actions ought naturally to excite, that England abounded in noble hearts and elevated minds, which would indubitably become our ardent advocates. The number of boats increased daily. Napoleon continued to appear at his usual hour, and the reception became more and more flattering. Numbers of every rank and condition had followed the Emperor. He was still with regard to most of us, as if at the Tuileries the Grand Marshal and Duc de Rovigo alone saw him habitually. Some had not approached or spoken to him more frequently than if we had been at Paris. I was called during the day, whenever there were any papers or letters to translate, until the Emperor insensibly contracted the habit of sending for me every evening towards 8 o'clock to converse with him a short time. In the conversation of this evening, and after touching on various subjects, he asked me whether I would accompany him to St. Helena. I replied with great frankness, rendered more easy by my real sentiments, observing to His Majesty that in quitting Paris I had disregarded every chance, and that therefore that of St. Helena had nothing which could make it an exception. There were, however, a great many of us round his person, while only 3 were permitted to go out. As some people considered it a crime in me to leave my family, it was necessary with regard to the latter, and my own conscience, to know that I could be useful and agreeable to him. That, in fact, I required to be chosen, but that this last observation did not spring from any concealed motive, for my life was henceforth at his disposal without any restriction. While thus engaged, Madame Bertrand, without having been called, and even without announcing her name, rushed into the cabin, and in a frantic manner entreated the Emperor not to go to St. Helena, nor take her husband with him. But observing the astonishment, coolness, and calm answer of Napoleon, she ran out as precipitately as she had entered. The Emperor, still surprised, turned to me and said, "Can you comprehend all this? Is she not mad?" In a moment after, loud shrieks were heard, and everybody seemed to be running towards the stern of the ship. Being desired to ring the bell and to inquire the cause, I found it was Madame Bertrand, who on leaving the cabin had attempted to throw herself into the sea, and was prevented with the greatest difficulty. From this scene it is easy to judge of our general feelings. Remarkable words of the Emperor. 2nd, 3rd. In the morning, the Duc de Rovigo told me I was certainly to depart for St. Helena. While in conversation with the Emperor a short time before, His Majesty had said to him that if there were only 2 to accompany him, I should be one of the number, as he thought I could afford him some consolation. I am indebted to the candour and kindness of the Duke for the satisfaction of being made acquainted with this flattering assurance, and am truly grateful, as but for him it would never have been known to me. The Emperor had not said a word in reply to my answer. This was his custom, as I shall have other opportunities of showing. I had no particular acquaintance with any of those who had followed the Emperor, except General and Madame Bertrand, who had shown me great attention during my mission to Illyria, where he was Governor-General. I had until then never spoken to the Duc de Rovigo, certain prepossessions having induced me to keep at a distance. We had, however, scarcely exchanged a few words, when my scruples were completely removed. Savary was sincerely attached to the Emperor. I knew he possessed warmth of heart, sincerity, and uprightness of character, qualities which rendered him susceptible of real friendship. We should therefore, I dare say, have become very intimate. I was again sent for by the Emperor, who, after alluding to different subjects, began to speak of St. Helena, asking me what sort of a place it could be, whether it was possible to exist there, and similar questions. "But," said he, "after all, am I quite sure of going there? Is a man dependent on others when he wishes that his dependence should cease?" We continued to walk to and fro in the cabin. He seemed calm, though affected, and somewhat absent. "My friend," continued the Emperor, "I have sometimes an idea of quitting you, and this would not be very difficult. It is only necessary to create a little mental excitement, and I shall soon have escaped. All will be over, and you can then tranquilly rejoin your families. This is the more easy, since my internal principles do not oppose any bar to it. I am one of those who conceive that the pains of the other world were only imagined as a counterpoise to those inadequate allurements which are offered to us there. God can never have willed such a contradiction to his infinite goodness, especially for an act of this kind, and what is it, after all, but wishing to return to him a little sooner? I remonstrated warmly against such notions. Poets and philosophers had said that it was a spectacle worthy of the divinity to see men struggling with fortune. Reverses and constancy had their glory. Such a great and noble character as his could not descend to the level of vulgar minds. He who had governed us with so much glory, who had excited the admiration and influenced the destinies of the world, could not end like a desperate gamester or disappointed lover. What would then become of all those who looked up to and placed their hopes in him? Would he thus abandon the field to his enemies? The anxiety shown by the latter to drive him to it was surely sufficient to make him resist. Who, besides, could tell the secrets of time, or dare assert what the future would produce? What might not the mere change of a ministry, death of a prince, that of a confidant, the slightest burst of passion, or the most trifling dispute bring about? "Some of these suggestions have their weight," said the Emperor, "but what can we do in that desolate place?" "Sire," I replied, "we will live on the past, there is enough of it to satisfy us. Do we not enjoy the life of Caesar and that of Alexander? We shall possess still more. You will reperuse yourself, sire." "Be it so," rejoined Napoleon. "We will write our memoirs. Yes, we must be employed, for occupation is the scythe of time. After all, a man ought to fulfill his destinies. This is my grand doctrine. Let mine also be accomplished." Reassuming from this instant an air of ease and even gaiety, he passed on to subjects totally unconnected with our situation. The following is a document, which the above circumstance contributes to render still more precious. It is an order of the day, issued by the First Consul to his guard, against suicide. Order of the 22 Floreal year X. The Grenadier Gobain has committed suicide from love. He was in other respects an excellent soldier. This is the second incident of the same nature that has occurred within a month. That the First Consul directs it to be inserted in the Audiobook of the Guard, that a soldier ought to know how to vanquish the pangs and melancholy of the passions, that there is as much true courage in bearing up against mental sufferings with constancy as in remaining firm on the wall of a battery. To give ourselves up to grief without resistance, or to kill ourselves to escape affliction, is to abandon the field of battle before the victory is gained. 4th. Orders had arrived during the night for us to sail at an early hour. When under way, our curiosity was greatly excited. The newspapers, official communications, and private conversations told us we were to be conveyed to St. Helena by the Northumberland. We knew that this ship was still fitting out at Portsmouth or Clapham, so that we might still calculate on 8 or 10 days' delay. The Bellerophon was too old for the voyage. She had not provisions enough. Moreover, the wind was contrary, when therefore we saw the ship returning up channel. Our uncertainty and conjectures were renewed. But whatever these might be, everything was welcome when compared to the idea of transportation to St. Helena. Nevertheless, it occurred to us that in such a decisive moment, the Emperor was bound to show an official opposition to this violence. As to Napoleon himself, he attached but little importance to it, nor would he trouble himself about the matter. "However," said we, "it will be a weapon in the hands of our friends, and leave causes of remembrance as well as grounds of defence with the public." I ventured, therefore, to read a paper I had prepared to His Majesty, with the general sense of which he seemed pleased. After suppressing a few phrases and correcting others, it was signed and sent to Lord Keith. The following is a literal copy of this document. Protest. I hereby solemnly protest in the face of heaven and mankind against the violence that is done me, and the violation of my most sacred rights in forcibly disposing of my person and liberty. I voluntarily came on board the Bellerophon. I am not the prisoner, I am the guest of England. I came at the instigation of the captain himself, who said he had orders from the government to receive and convey me to England, together with my suite, if agreeable to me. I came forward with confidence to place myself under the protection of the laws of England. When once on board the Bellerophon, I was entitled to the hospitality of the British people. If the government, in giving the captain of the Bellerophon orders to receive me and my followers, only wished to lay a snare, it has forfeited its honour and disgraced its flag. If this act be consummated, it will be in vain for the English henceforth to talk of their sincerity, their laws and liberties. British faith will have been lost in the hospitality of the Bellerophon. I appeal to history, it will say, that an enemy who made war for 20 years against the English people came spontaneously, in the hour of misfortune, to seek an asylum under their laws. What more striking proof could he give of his esteem and confidence? But how did England reply to such an act of magnanimity? It pretended to hold out a hospitable hand to this enemy, and on giving himself up with confidence, he was immolated. Bellerophon at sea, Friday, Aug. 4th, 1815. The Duke de Rovigo told me that the Emperor demanded permission to send me to the Prince Regent at London, but that it was obstinately refused. The sea was rough, and the wind blew with violence. Most of us were affected with seasickness. But what cannot the preoccupation of the mind effect over physical infirmities? This was, perhaps, the only time in my life that I was not incapacitated by such weather. On leaving Plymouth Sound, we stood to the eastward before the wind, but were soon after close-hauled, tacking backwards and forwards, without being able to comprehend the cause of this new source of torment. 5th. The whole of this day was passed in the same manner. While conversing with the Emperor in the evening, he gave me 2 proofs of confidence, but I cannot now confide them to paper. There is, however, one of those proofs which I am now at liberty to disclose. While walking in the Stera Gallery with the Emperor at the usual hour, he drew from under his waistcoat, still conversing on a totally different subject, a species of girdle, which he handed to me, saying, "Take care of that for me," without interrupting him. I placed it under my own waistcoat. The Emperor told me soon after that it contained a diamond necklace worth 200,000 francs, which Queen Hortense favoured him to accept on his leaving Malmaison. After our arrival at St. Helena, I frequently spoke of returning the necklace, but never received any reply. Having ventured to mention the subject again when we were at Longwood, Napoleon dryly asked, "Does it annoy you?" "No, sir," was my answer. "Keep it then," said he. "From wearing the girdle so long, the necklace became as it were identified with my person, and I thought so little about it that it was not till some days after my being torn from Longwood, and by the merest accident it recurred to my memory, when I shuddered at the idea of depriving the Emperor of such a resource. For how would it be possible now to make restitution? I was in the most rigorous confinement, surrounded by gaolers and sentinels, so that all communication was impracticable. I vainly endeavoured to contrive a plan. Time pressed, only a few days were left, and nothing could be more distressing than thus to quit the island. In this predicament, I resolved to run all risks. An Englishman, to whom I had often spoken, came to the prison on a particular errand, and it was under the eyes of the governor himself, or one of his most confidential agents whom he brought, that I ventured to communicate my wishes. "I think you are a man of principle," said I, "and I am going to put it to the test, though with nothing injurious or contrary to your honour, merely a rich deposit to be restored to Napoleon. If you accept the charge, my son will put it into your pocket." He answered only by slackening his pace. My son, whom I had prepared for the scene, followed us, and the necklace was transferred into this man's possession, almost in sight of the military attendants. Before quitting the island, I had the inexpressible satisfaction of knowing that the necklace had reached the hands of the Emperor. How gratifying is the recollection and recital of such a trait on the part of an enemy, and under such circumstances! Anchored off Start Point. Persons allowed to accompany the Emperor. 6th. We anchored about noon off Start Point, where there was no shelter whatever, though we had but a very short distance to go in order to anchor in Torbay. This circumstance excited great astonishment on our part. We had, however, heard that orders were given to meet the Northumberland, the departure of which vessel from Portsmouth was urged with all possible haste. Accordingly, that ship soon appeared with 2 frigates full of troops, which were to compose the garrison of St. Helena. Those 3 ships came to an anchor close to us, after which the communications amongst the whole squadron became very active. The precautions lest any boats should approach were still continued. Meanwhile, the mystery of our precipitate sailing from Plymouth, and all the manoeuvring that followed, was discovered. Lord Keith had, we were told, received notice by telegraph that a public officer had just left London with a writ of habeas corpus to claim the person of the Emperor in the name of the laws or of some competent tribunal. We could neither verify the motives nor details of this circumstance. The Admiral, it was added, had scarcely time enough to escape this difficulty. We heard that he was suddenly obliged to go on board a brig and quit Plymouth Sound. This was the motive which kept us out of Torbay. Admirals Keith and Cockburn came on board the Bellerophon. The flag of the latter was flying on board the Northumberland. They had a conference with the Emperor, to whom they delivered an extract from the instructions relative to our transportation to and stay at St. Helena. These stated that all our effects were to be examined, for the purpose of taking away the money, bills, and diamonds belonging to the Emperor, as well as ourselves, to be kept for us. We also heard that our arms would be taken from us at the same time, and that we were then to be transferred to the Northumberland. The documents were as follows. Order from Lord Keith to Captain Maitland of the Bellerophon. All arms of every description are to be taken from the French, of whatever rank, who are on board His Majesty's ship under your command. These arms will be carefully packed, and are to remain in your charge so long as the persons to whom they belong continue on board the Bellerophon. They will then be under the charge of the captain of the ship to which the said individuals may be transferred. Start Bay, August the 6th, 1815. Instructions of Ministers to Admiral Cockburn. When General Bonaparte leaves the Bellerophon to go on board the Northumberland, it will be the properest moment for Admiral Cockburn to have the effects examined which General Bonaparte may have brought with him. The Admiral will allow the baggage, the wines, an observation truly worthy of the English ministers, and provisions which the General may have brought with him, to be taken on board the Northumberland. Among the baggage his table service shall be understood as included, unless it be so considerable as to seem rather an article to be converted into ready money than for real use. His money, his diamonds, and his saleable effects, consequently bills of exchange also, of whatever kind they may be, must be delivered up. The Admiral will declare it to the General that the British government by no means intends to confiscate his property, but merely to take upon itself the administration of his effects, to hinder him from using them as a means to promote his escape. The examination shall be made in the presence of a person named by General Bonaparte. The inventory of the effects to be retained shall be signed by this person, as well as by the Rear Admiral, or by the person whom he shall appoint to draw up the inventory. The interest or the principal, according as his property is more or less considerable, shall be applied to his support, and in this respect the principal arrangement is to be left to him. For this purpose he can from time to time signify his wishes to the Admiral, till the arrival of the new governor of St. Helena, and afterwards to the latter, and if no objection is made to his proposal, the Admiral or the governor can give the necessary orders, and the disbursement will be paid by bills on His Majesty's treasury. In case of death, what foresight! He can dispose of his property by a last will, and may be assured that the contents of his testament shall be faithfully executed. As an attempt might be made to make a part of his property pass for the property of the persons of his suite, it must be signified that the property of his attendants is subject to the same regulations. The Admiral is not to take any person on board for St. Helena without the consent of such person, to whom he is previously to explain the necessity of being subjected to all the regulations which it may be thought proper to establish for securing the person of the General. It must be made known to the General that if he make any attempt to escape, he will expose himself to close imprisonment, and that any of his suite who may be discovered in endeavouring to facilitate his escape will incur the same punishment. Afterwards the Act of Parliament made the latter offence death. All letters which shall be addressed to him or to any of his suite are to be delivered in the first place to the Admiral or the Governor, who is to read them previously to transmitting them. The same regulation is to be observed with respect to letters written by the General or those of his suite. The General is to be informed that the Governor and the Admiral have received positive orders to forward to His Majesty's Government any request or representation he may think proper to make. Nothing is left to their discretion on this point, but the paper on which such representations shall be written is to remain open in order that they may subjoin such observations as they may think expedient. It would not be easy to conceive the intensity and nature of our feelings at this decisive moment, in which outrage, violence, and injustice were accumulated on our heads. Constrained to reduce his suite to 3 persons, the Emperor selected the Grand Marshal, M. de Montholon, and myself. Gourgaud, in despair at the idea of being left behind, entered into a negotiation on the subject, and succeeded. As the instructions only allowed Napoleon to take 3 officers, it was agreed that I should be considered purely in a civil capacity, and to admit a 4th by the aid of this interpretation. Conversation with Lord Keith. Examination of the Emperor's effects. He quits the Bellerophon. Separation. We sail for St. Helena. 7th. The Emperor addressed to Lord Keith a species of new protest against the violence done to his person in forcibly removing him from the Bellerophon. I took it on board the Tonnant. Admiral Keith, a fine-looking old man of highly polished manners, received me with great politeness, but he carefully avoided touching on the subject of the protest, observing that he would give an answer in writing. This did not stop me. I stated the situation of Napoleon, who was very unwell, having his legs considerably swelled, and pointed out to his lordship how desirable it was for the Emperor not to be sent off so suddenly. He replied that I had been a sailor, and must therefore see the anchorage was unsafe, which was certainly true. I explained the Emperor's repugnance to have his effects searched and tossed about as proposed, assuring him Napoleon would infinitely prefer seeing them thrown into the sea. The Admiral answered that as this was a positive order, he could not infringe on it. Finally, I demanded whether it was probable those appointed to search would go so far as to deprive the Emperor of his sword. He said that it would be respected, but that Napoleon was the only person exempted, as all his followers would be disarmed. I showed him that I was already so, my sword having been taken from me before I left the Bellerophon. A secretary who was writing near us observed to Lord Keith in English that the order stated that Napoleon himself was to be disarmed, upon which the Admiral dryly replied also in English, as well as I could comprehend, "Mind your own business, sir, and leave us to ourselves." Still continuing the conversation, I went over all that had occurred from the commencement. I had been the negotiator said I ought therefore to feel most acutely, and had the greater right to be heard. Lord Keith listened to me with marked impatience. We were standing, and his frequent bows were evidently to make me retire. When I told him that Captain Maitland said he had been authorized to bring us to England without exciting a suspicion in our minds that we were to be prisoners of war, that the captain could not deny we came on board voluntarily and in confidence, that the letter of the Emperor to the Prince of Wales, which I had previously communicated to Captain Maitland, must necessarily have created tacit conditions, since he made no remarks on it. At length the Admiral's ill humour and even anger broke forth, and he replied sharply that if such were the case, Captain Maitland must have been a fool, for his instructions contained nothing of the kind, and he was quite sure of this, for it was from himself they had emanated. But my lord, said I, permit me to observe in defence of Captain Maitland that your lordship speaks with a degree of severity for which you may become responsible for not only Captain Maitland but Admiral Hotham and all the other officers whom we saw at the time conducted and expressed themselves in the same way towards us. Would it have been thus if their instructions had been so clear and positive? Saying this, I relieved the Admiral of my presence. He made no attempt to prolong a subject which perhaps his lordship's conscience rendered somewhat painful to him. Admiral Cockburn, aided by an officer of the customs, examined the effects of the Emperor. They seized 4,000 Napoleons and left 1,500 to meet present exigencies. This was all the Emperor's treasure. They were assisted, or rather impeded in the operation, by Marchand, the valet de chambre of His Majesty. This appeared to mortify the Admiral excessively. They requested to attend. Not one amongst us would lend his presence to, or witness an act which we regarded as being at once mean and outrageous. Meanwhile, the moment of quitting the Bellerophon arrived. The Grand Marshal had been some time closeted with the Emperor, during which we remained in the outer cabin. On the door being opened, the Duc de Rovigo, bursting into tears, threw himself at the feet of Napoleon, who, still calm and collected, embraced the Duke, and continued his way towards the accommodation ladder, graciously saluting all those who happened to be on the quarter-deck. The whole of our party whom we left behind were in a state of the deepest anguish, nor could I help observing to Lord Keith, who stood near me at the time, "You see, my lord, that the only persons who shed tears are those who remain." We reached the Northumberland between 1 and 2 o'clock. The Emperor remained on deck, conversing familiarly and cheerfully with those of the English who approached him. Lord Lowther and a Mr. Littleton had a long conversation with him on politics and government. I heard nothing of what passed. The Emperor seemed desirous that we should leave him to himself. I employed this moment of leisure in writing a last adieu to my wife and friends. Indeed, I felt very unwell and much fatigued. At the moment of getting under way, a cutter that was plying round the ship to keep off the people ran down a boat full of spectators close to us. Fatality seems to have brought them from a great distance to become the victims of this accident. I understood that there were 2 women amongst those who perished. Thus were we at length under sail for St. Sainber. Helena, 13 days after our arrival at Plymouth, and 40 from our quitting Paris. Those of the attendants whom Napoleon was not allowed to take with him were the last to quit the ship, bearing with them mingled proofs of satisfaction and regret. Their departure gave rise to a second scene, not less affecting than the first. The Emperor retired to the cabin allotted to him about 7 o'clock. The English ministry warmly censured the respect which had been shewn to the Emperor on board the Bellerophon, and issued fresh orders in consequence, so that a totally different style of manner and expression was affected in the Northumberland. The crew seemed to betray a ridiculous anxiety to be covered before the Emperor. It had been strictly enjoined to give him no other title than that of general, and only to treat him as such. This was the ingenious contrivance, the happy conception engendered by the diplomacy of the English ministers, and the title they thought proper to confer on him whom they had recognized as First Consul, whom they had so often styled head of the French government, with whom they treated as Emperor at Paris, when Lord Lauderdale was employed to negotiate, and, perhaps, even signed articles at Châtillon. Hence, in a moment of warmth, the Emperor, in allusion to this regulation, observed, "They may call me whatever they choose, but they cannot prevent me from being myself." It was in fact no less whimsical than ridiculous to see the ministers of England attach such importance to giving only the title of general to one who had governed so large a portion of Europe, and made 7 or 8 kings, of whom several still retained this title of his creation, who had been 10 years Emperor of the French, and been anointed as well as consecrated in that quality by the head of the Church, one who could boast 2 or 3 elections of the French people to the sovereignty, who had been acknowledged as emperor by the whole of continental Europe, had treated as such with all the sovereigns, concluding every species of alliance both of blood and interest with them, so that he united in his person every title, civil, political, and religious, existing amongst men, and which, by a singular though real coincidence, not one of the reigning princes of Europe could have shewn accumulated in an equal degree. Napoleon was not only the chief, but founder of his own dynasty. Nevertheless, His Majesty, who intended, had he landed in England, to have assumed the name and title of Colonel Duroc or Muron, no longer thought of it now that his legitimate titles were disputed. Description of the Emperor's cabin on board the Northumberland. 8th, 9th. The ship was in the greatest confusion, and seemed to be quite encumbered with men as well as stores and luggage. We sailed in so great a hurry that there was scarcely anything on board in its place, so that the whole crew were now occupied in restoring order and preparing for the voyage. The following particulars will afford some idea of the ship occupied by the Emperor and his suite. The space abaft the mizzen-mast contained 2 public and 2 private cabins. The first was a dining room, about 10 feet broad, and extending the whole width of the ship, lighted by a porthole at each end, and a skylight above. The drawing-room was composed of all the remaining space, diminished by 2 symmetrical cabins on the right and left, each having an entry from the dining or mess room, and another from the drawing-room. The Emperor occupied that on the left, in which his camp bedstead had been put up, that on the right was appropriated to the Admiral. It was, above all, promptly enjoined that the drawing-room should be in common, and not given up to the Emperor. To such a ridiculous extent had the fears and solicitude of the ministry been carried. The form of the dining table resembled that of the mess room. The Emperor sat with his back to the drawing-room or after cabin, and looking towards the head of the ship. On his left sat Madame Bertrand, and on his right the Admiral. On the right of the Admiral sat Madame de Mentholon. These filled one side of the table. At the end next that lady was Captain Ross, who commanded the ship, opposite whom, at the corresponding end, sat M. de Montholon by Madame Bertrand, next him the Admiral's secretary. The remaining space was the side of the table opposite the Emperor, which, beginning from Captain Ross, was occupied by the Grand Marshal, the general commanding the 53rd Regiment, myself, and Baron Gourgaud. The Admiral invited one or two of the officers every day, who were intermixed amongst us at table. I generally sat almost opposite the Emperor. The band of the 53rd, which had been recently formed, exercised during dinner at the expense of our ears. We had 2 courses, but there was a want of provision. Our tastes were, besides, very different from those of our hosts. It is true, they did their utmost, but, after all, it would not do to be difficult. I was lodged with my son on the starboard side, even with the mainmast, in a small cabin enclosed with canvas, and having a gun in it. We made as much sail as the wind would permit to get out of the channel, and stood along the coast of England, communicating with all the ports in order to procure additional supplies of sea stock and complete the stores of the ship. A large quantity of articles was brought to us from Plymouth, off which port we were joined by several other vessels, as well as from Falmouth. We lose sight of land. Reflections. Argument against the English ministers. 10th. This day we cleared the channel and lost sight of land. We had now entered upon the dreary unknown course to which fate had doomed us. Again my agonies were renewed. Again the dear connections I had abandoned resumed their influence over my heart. I indulged in the luxuriance of grief and found a miserable satisfaction in its excess. "Objects of all my affections," I exclaimed, "friends of my heart, for whom alone I live, reflect that I am proving myself worthy of you. Let that thought support you also, and, oh, forget me not." Meanwhile, we advanced in our course, and were soon to be out of Europe. Thus, in less than 6 weeks, had the Emperor abdicated his throne, and placed himself in the hands of the English, who were now hurrying him to a barren rock in the midst of a vast ocean. This is certainly no ordinary instance of the chances of fortune, and no common trial of the firmness of the mind. Yet will posterity be better able to judge of these 3 leading circumstances than we of the present day? They will have to pronounce on a clear horizon, whereas we are enveloped in clouds. Scarcely had Napoleon descended from his throne, when those who witnessed the misfortunes which followed regarded his sacrifice as a capital error. When they heard of his being a prisoner at Plymouth, they censured his magnanimity. There was not a single incident even to his suffering himself to be sent to St. Helena, which they did not make a subject of reproach. But such is the tendency of vulgar minds, never judging except on what they see at the moment. It is, however, impossible to judge of one resolution without considering not only the evils which unavoidably attend it, but those which a contrary determination might have produced. By abdicating, Napoleon rallied all the friends of their country round one point, that of its safety. He left France demanding before all nations nothing but the sacred rights of national independence. He took from the Allies every pretext to ravage and dismember our territory. He destroyed all idea of his personal ambition, terminating his career as the martyr of a cause of which he had been the hero. If all the advantages which might have been derived from his genius and talents as a citizen were not obtained, it is to be imputed to the weakness and treachery of the transitory government by which he was succeeded. When he arrived at Rochefort, and the commander of the frigates refused to sail, ought he to have abandoned the fruits of his abdication? Should he have returned to the interior, and placed himself at the head of mere bands, when he had renounced armies? Or ought he to have desperately encouraged a civil war which would lead to no beneficial result, but only serve to ruin the remaining pillars, the future hopes of the country? In this state of affairs he formed a most magnanimous resolution, worthy of his life, and a complete refutation of the calumnies that for 20 years had been so ridiculously accumulated on his head. But what will history say of those ministers of a liberal nation, the guardians and depositaries of popular rights, ever ardent in encouraging a Coriolanus, having only chains for a Camillus? As to the reproach of suffering himself to be transported to St. Helena, it would be a disgrace to answer such a charge. To contend with an adversary in the cabin of a ship, kill someone with his own hand, or attempt to set fire to the powder magazine, would have been, at best, the act of a dignity in misfortune. Submission to necessity have also their glory. It is that which becomes great men overwhelmed by adversity. When the English ministers found themselves in possession of Napoleon's person, passion had much more influence over them than justice or policy. They neglected the triumph of their laws, denied the rights of hospitality, disregarded their own honor, and compromised that of their country. They determined to exile their guest in the midst of the ocean, 2,000 leagues from Europe, and far from all communion with mankind. It seemed that they wished to trust to the anguish of exile, the fatigues of a long voyage, privations of every kind, and the corroding influence of a burning climate, for effecting that which they feared to perform themselves. In order, however, to gain over the public voice, to make it appear that their conduct was indispensably necessary, the newspapers were instigated to irritate the passions of the multitude by reviving former calumnies and falsehoods, while the ministers, on their side, represented their own determination as an engagement entered into with their allies. We presented ourselves at the moment of popular effervescence, just as everything which could render us odious had been brought forward. The public journals were full of the most virulent declamations, maliciously raking up every act and expression of the previous struggle of 20 years that could wound the national pride or rekindle its hatred. Yet, when all England hurried to the south to see us during our stay at Plymouth, the conduct and sentiments of the multitudes who came was enough to convince us that this factious irritation would disappear of itself. Hence we were led to hope, on our departure, that the British people would daily grow more impartial in a cause to which they were no longer parties, that the current of public opinion would eventually turn against ministers, and that we had thus prepared formidable attacks and a terrible responsibility for them at a future day. Under these circumstances, what could these ministers have replied had any member of Parliament risen and made use of the following argument? We have just been favoured by an unexampled instance of success. Fortune has caused our most constant and implacable enemy to surrender at discretion. We have suddenly found ourselves masters of the fate of the French sovereign and people. It was in our power to dispose of the future, or at least to enchain its unfavourable chances for a long period. Have our ministers profited by so many advantages? Have they ensured our interests, happiness, and glory? Have they guaranteed a durable peace, the first of our wishes, the most pressing of our wants? Have they extinguished that turbulent agitation, that warlike disposition throughout Europe, which keeps every nation in arms? Have they secured that happy political equilibrium which prevents revolutions and reduces war to a mere trifle? Have they strengthened and propagated our national principles? Have they secured for us the respect and affection of the European family as the price of our efforts in its favour? Have they proved the excellence and superiority of our institutions and laws? Alas, I hear only negatives to all these questions. Europe was never more inflamed. Its situation is at best only an armed truce. Each power increases the number of its soldiers. The political balance is totally destroyed and broken. In a neighbouring state we have annihilated the very principles which form the sacred basis of our own political theory. Universal jealousy animates the whole continent against us, and our civil laws have sustained an outrage calculated to leave an indelible stain on the nation. Do our ministers flatter themselves that the destruction of our rival is a sufficient answer to every charge? But how are we so deeply interested in her destruction? In sound policy, is not her existence necessary to our glory and stability? For I am one of those who fear our own excesses, should we remain uncontrolled in the midst of prosperity. But what do I say? This very rival may be essentially necessary to us, either as an ally or counterpoise. It would be the height of folly to imagine that the great struggle being over, the continental states will not again give way to their natural jealousy of our maritime power, so prejudicial to their interests. In sincerely uniting themselves to us, they merely warded off the most pressing danger. New disputes and difficulties must infallibly arise, and if that system of universal monarchy, which has so often endangered us, and which we overturned when it extended from the south towards the north, should menace us again, by coming from the north towards the south, where would be our resource? How blind, then, is our policy, to annihilate France by imposing on her a government that our armies are obliged to defend and preserve? Above all, why have we drawn the personal animosity of its immense population on ourselves? If the weakening or even destruction of France was our real interest, it ought to have been effected. Though justice might have censured the step, policy would have excused it. But it should have been frankly avowed. Nations as well as individuals know how to submit to necessity. When the vanquished are plainly told that the rights of victory are exercised over them, their pride is soothed by reflecting on the vicissitudes of fortune, but their hearts are filled with bitterness and rage. If they are plundered under the mask of hypocrisy and bad faith, this is to add outrage to violence. Why, therefore, say that you only seek the happiness of France, while you load her with contributions? Why pretend to have no other object in view but her deliverance from tyranny, and yet inflict intolerable sufferings on her? Why profess to have only made war against a single man, and yet trample on a whole nation? Why seize her fortresses, and strip her of the trophies of her victories? Not because she had been vanquished in her turn, which would have been natural and just, but under the pretense that these possessions were only the result of robbery and plunder? Why so much contradiction between words and actions? Because the real object of these proceedings is one which those who aim at it dare not avow. Because the doctrine which guides them is too unpopular to be acknowledged. Because they endeavour to serve a party in Europe rather than eternal principles. Far be it from me to make any personal application. I wish to avoid passion and prejudice. I consider no other interest at this moment but that of my country. May our ministers entertain the same sentiments. But how came they to place England amongst, or at the head of powers who have shamelessly and in the face of Europe violated the sacred rights of national independence? How could they dare to sanction such doctrines? In their stay at the Congress of Vienna, did they intoxicate themselves over the cup of the old continental doctrines? Or did the arrival of the sovereigns in this country inoculate them with sentiments of absolute power, destroying the national maxim of the people's rights? What can have led them to overturn the solemn choice of a nation? Napoleon, on his return, had consecrated the very same public institutions and fundamental laws which we ourselves boast. All his strength and popularity arose from these acts. Had he afterwards infringed on them, both would have been lost. He was too wise and too strong to be suspected of such a design. The institution of both nations would, therefore, have corresponded with each other, in spite of all obstacles. Perhaps this might have been the prelude to a new and unknown system, when the people of two countries, which had, till now, only felt repugnance and hatred against each other, might have thenceforth formed a natural union, with common and inseparable interests. Instead of this, narrow and unjust views have thrown us into a position altogether forced and unnatural. Great Britain appears to stand in direct opposition to its manners, religion, constitution, and laws. We, a free people, impose chains on our neighbours. We, a sovereign people, must destroy the sovereignty of the people next us. We, the guardians of liberal ideas, employ our armies to extinguish those very ideas. We, the protectors and head of the Protestant faith, permit the massacre of our brethren in France, and in sight of our national banners. Let not ministers take credit to themselves for maintaining by this system a large army on the continent, which will cost us nothing. I dread such an advantage much more than some reverses. In a foreign land, our soldiers will become foreigners. They will at last have no other country than the field of battle. The manners and maxims of our youth will become corrupted amidst the maxims and manners of other nations. If ministers, the guardians of our constitution, had inherited the spirit of our forefathers, instead of thinking it important to preserve a large army, they would rather have been eager to reduce it. Will ministers justify themselves on the plea that the Allies wished, once for all, utterly to destroy the revolutionary principle? But the revolution had ended and has been recommenced by the Allies themselves. The sovereigns, by insisting on prerogatives and favouring the aristocratical faction to excess, have again awakened the jealousy and roused the passions of the people. Europe will soon be divided throughout into the two extreme parties of Marius and Sylla. The cause of kings and their courts had been gained. They have hazarded it once more. Whither may not this lead us? There is no nation in Europe that suffers so much from the French Revolution as France. Will that unhappy country be destined to become a spectacle of the contrary excesses? I must notice a vulgar error propagated by our late measures. The very man who is now charged with all the crimes of the Revolution is he who miraculously stopped it in its course, with the energy and force of an athletic champion stopping a chariot in the midst of its rapid career. It was he who replaced France in the European community, who re-established the manners, principles, and language of modern civilization. It was he who removed the stains of that very revolution by actions the most brilliant and glorious. On entering France, the Allies could not help doing homage to his monuments, institutions, and administration, an administration the most vigorous and enlightened hitherto known. What would have become of the sovereigns of Vienna and Berlin if, on entering their capitals, he had revolutionized their subjects? It is well known that he rather kept down the germs of commotion found in these states, so much so indeed that the revolutionists of the day considered him as an apostate from the revolution. How does it happen that circumstances and our injudicious conduct now point him out as its martyr and messiah to these very people? It was proper to make war against him while he was formidable to us, but we should have coalesced with his genius the moment our first object was attained. Let ministers, therefore, no longer attempt to justify their conduct and measures by telling us they were implicitly prescribed by the grand principle of legitimacy. What can they possibly mean by that? Is it the absolute prohibition of every new dynasty whatever? Can there be men ignorant of the fact that this principle, however true in theory, is only decided by facts in the political world? Do they not know that crowns are in the hands of God and in the winning of battles? If that of Waterloo had taken a different turn, what would have become of this famous principle? Would they have refused to treat sine qua non? And do they really and sincerely expect to make us believe that Europe could no longer exist were a new dynasty to appear? Dare they maintain that the welfare of nations depends upon a religious belief, that the favour of heaven has been entirely exhausted on the reigning families of the present day? But how long has this been the creed of our ministers? How is it that they have become so difficult and scrupulous on this principle? Have their various communications and secret understandings with Vienna not only established a coalition of kings, but also a coalition of doctrines and ministers, a conspiracy against fortune and the irresistible force of events? We must then have been much less scrupulous when we acknowledged the first consul and received his ambassadors, or when, at a later period, and while at war with him, we recognized him as head of the French government, when we sent Lord Lauderdale to Paris for the purpose of treating with the Emperor of the French, when these very ministers treated on the same footing at Châtillon, and, perhaps, even signed articles. If these had been ratified, what would then have become of the sanctity of the new principle? Why are they at this moment so indifferent to the events of Spain, where a son has dethroned his father? How do they happen to be the allies of Sweden, whence the legitimate sovereign has been exiled, to call in a foreigner? But, what is still more extraordinary, how durst they adopt this new doctrine, without thinking of the family which governs us, of the glorious revolution which placed it upon the throne, of the excellent laws by which its sway has been distinguished, and which has ruled us with so much glory to the present time? But enough has been said of the errors of our ministers abroad. I turn to an act of their domestic policy which outrages our laws and wounds our honour. I allude to the transportation of Napoleon. This noble adversary, by an act of magnanimity worthy of his life, disdaining to address himself to the Emperor of Russia, who had called himself his friend, disdaining to apply to the Emperor of Austria, whose son-in-law he was, selected an asylum in our island, in the bosom of a nation against which he had fought for 20 years, because, persecuted by all the sovereigns of Europe, he still wished, in all his misfortunes, to preserve his independence, and thought to find it in the stability and empire of our laws. What nobler triumph could England have? What greater homage could be paid to our institutions? Our ministers laid a snare for him, they encouraged his sentiments, and when he placed himself in their power, they loaded him with chains, for it is a fact which no person can deny, that Napoleon came on board the Bellerophon freely and of his own accord. He was told that orders had been given to the captain to receive and conduct him to England. These assurances were taken by him as an engagement of hospitality. His letter to the Prince Regent is a proof of this, and that engagement ought to have been valid for him, when the letter, which was communicated before he himself appeared, passed without any observation being made on it. It is in vain for ministers to answer that they were forced to deliver him up to the ostracism of kings, and that they had engaged to do so. Their answer leaves them in the following shameful dilemma. Either they made that engagement before his arrival, and by enticing him forfeited their honour, or it was made after his coming, and therefore they betrayed their duty in subjecting our laws and our dignity to foreign councils. I demand, therefore, that Napoleon be brought back, and that he be landed in this country, which he had chosen as an asylum. I demand this as a solemn reparation for the outrage offered to our laws, which, by this triumph, will become more renowned from their momentary violation. The Emperor's mode of living on board the Northumberland.